Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of DeLoreanTECH. Today I'm going to walk you through the process of changing the ground cable for your battery and going with a John Hervey style setup where you are grounding the battery directly to the transmission casing and then back to the trailing arm bolt. So the car is ground. You can kind of see it right there. The main battery ground was the plate that's connected to the trailing arm. And one of the more popular ways to go is to ground it to the transmission and then run another wire, another battery cable, to the trailing arm bolt in the original location. And that has shown to be an improvement electrically. And but I didn't stop there. I went ahead and added a redundant ground from the other side of the transmission right there, and that goes to the trailing arm plate bolt on the driver's side, and then another ground wire goes to the front of the vehicle where the main wiring harness is. So I'm going to walk you through the installation of that and how I did it.
Okay, so here's the materials I went with. I went with welding cable. I'm using a 0 gauge welding cable, about a 25-foot roll. That was the smallest roll that they had, and should be sufficient for what I need. I don't recommend using copper-clad aluminum battery cable. The conductivity of copper-clad aluminum is not as good as pure copper. Additionally, the battery cables are typically not as flexible as welding cable. Welding cable has much finer strands of pure copper inside the cable versus copper-clad aluminum. Basically what it is just aluminum dipped in copper. So for smaller applications, maybe car stereo type applications, you can probably get away with using that. But for your main ground in a car, I really recommend going with 100% copper battery wire, or better yet, welding cable, which is very flexible. You can get around tight bends and stuff like that. And from where I'm going to be routing this, flexibility is going to be key. So I went with 0 gauge wire. I also picked up some of these cable lugs. So I went with a 0 gauge wire mainly because that was about the biggest I could go and still be able to get through the channel in the car that I wanted to route through. Okay, so the stuff I'm using here is this 0 gauge Tough Flex welding cable. Handles up to 600 volts. Wide temperature range. That's another thing. In cold weather, you're going to want to use welding cable versus battery cable. And it's always important to make sure that whatever you're buying, if you can, make sure it's made in the USA. So for the welding cable, I just picked this up from Amazon, but here's the model number and all the specifics. So it's black, 0 gauge, 25-foot spool of welding cable. So we're going to go underneath the car and we're going to have a proper look at what we have to deal with. And so here's the transmission. So the idea behind all this is to ground the battery to the transmission and then back to the brackets that are holding the trailing arm bolts in. So we'll need to remove these air deflector plates from the vehicle. So my plan is to run a new ground wire to
from where the ground is now at the trailing arm bolt location, not the bolt itself, but there's a bracket that holds it in to the trailing arm. Undo that a little bit, get the new ground hooked up to that, and then ground it to the transmission. And then what we're going to do is a little extended grounding. I'm going to run another ground wire from this trailing arm bolt all the way to the front of the car, and then I'm going to ground that to the transmission as well. So that's the plan. So we're going to start with removing the air deflector plate here. All I got to do is just loosen up these little nuts here and just take them off. Excess inside here. It just has some clips that hold it on there. Just be careful taking it off. There's a cable here that you need to go through. There we go. So that's off. And there's the trailing arm bolt right there. So we will be making our new ground connection to one of these bolts here that is holding in this plate right here. And from there we'll be connecting a ground wire from one of these bolts to the transmission, and then from that same point to the front of the car where the ground for the front wiring harness is. So we'll go ahead and remove the other air deflector shield as well. After you take these off, you're going to want to put the nuts and also the washers in a safe place, because you may have the air deflector shields off for a little while, so you don't want to misplace or have these move around to where you can't find them anymore. I definitely recommend using some eye protection taking this off, because there's a lot of debris underneath here that could fall down on you. Sure. So there's these little tabs here that connect to the frame. It's pretty easy to take this off. Okay, so let's have a look. Okay, so here's where we have the battery compartment inside the cabin of the vehicle. So the power and ground wires coming out right there, and looks like ground wires connected to the trailing arm bracket bolt right there. So what I'm going to want to do is connect that to the transmission. So the next thing you're going to want to do is to start fishing your cable. And what I'm going to do is I am going to run the long section of cable to the trailing arm bolt location all the way through the channel here where the high side compressor hose and the clutch line run, all the way to the front of the vehicle. And I'm going to make a connection to ground where the front wiring harness is grounded to. So I'm going to run it through this cavity right here, And that shouldn't be too hard because there's only a couple things running in there. On the other side, there's a lot more running through there, so that probably wouldn't be an option. This looks like the only option. So in doing this, I'm going to want to start with my spool over here, and I want to run my cable through the cavity this way. So I don't want to make any cuts yet. I just want to get the cable over there. You're going to have to go through this cavity right here. And once I get it over there, I can, what I'll do is I'll actually make the connection, and then I'll come back over here, cut the cable, and make the connection to the trailing arm bolt and the transmission. So right now I've got my ground cable positioned where I want it to go. And what I'm going to do is, here's the end of it right here. I'm going to fish it through all the way through this channel right here, all the way to the front of the car. I could go the other way. I could run it starting from there with the spool and run it all the way this way, but I'm thinking I'm going to go this way mainly because of this this location here looks like it's going to be a little easier to access. I looked at the other side. It looks like it might be a challenge. I think I can work a little easier on this side than I can with the other side. So I'm going to go from this way to the front of the car. Then I'm going to run. There's the trailing arm bolt, bracket bolt right there. That's the main support for the trailing arm. That bracket right there, and you're just going to want to remove one of the bolts. I'm thinking that's going to be that one, and then make your ground connection there, and then back to the transmission. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run the ground cable sort of underneath the clutch line and the high pressure compressor hose. And I'm just going to try to slowly fish it through by pushing it through, and then I'm going to take a screwdriver and just kind of direct it through this little channel. Don't got too far to go, so I was able to just push it through, and I've got it almost all the way through. So I'm here at the end. I'm just going to kind of push up a little bit on the clutch cable and the compressor hose, and then just try to keep pushing it through until it makes it all the way past this point right here. So you can kind of see it in there. It's kind of hard to see it on the camera, but it's in there. It's got to push it through. Kind of hard to do with one hand. So I was able to push the ground wire through this channel here. So it fit in there pretty good. It was very easy actually to get that in there. So now I'm going to pull it through and route it over the suspension right there up to the front of the vehicle. So here we are at the front of the vehicle, right behind the rear or the front suspension here, and you can see that I've got the ground cable through that channel. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to basically run it over the suspension. So yeah, basically want to connect it to, so here's the front harness ground location right here. I've already been playing around with this. There's a bracket that comes here that's actually connected there. I moved it over temporarily so I can gain access to this connection right here. There's a bolt that's in there and some washers, and that is where the front wiring harness is grounded. So that's where I'm going to route my ground cable. So I think I've fished enough, probably more than enough through. If I have to trim a little bit off, that's fine, or fish it back, that's probably what I'll end up doing. It's pretty easy. The way I did it was, as I was pushing through on the back end, I was pulling through here. So I actually had one hand here, one hand on the other side, and I would just slowly push it through. You just got to make sure that you don't start wrapping around your clutch line and the compressor hose that's in there. Just make sure that wherever you decide you want to route it, it's continuously along that path and not going up and down and all over the place. So I've got mine basically underneath where the clutch cable is, and around here it kind of wants to go in a different direction, but it's okay. So I'm gonna, once I wrap it, or once I route it above the suspension, it should be fine. Okay, so let's give that a shot. So I'm just gonna take my cable here and I'm just gonna fish it over the suspension, trying to follow where the compressor hose is routed through. Okay, so make sure that there's nothing being compromised in there. Okay, so I can just route this up this way. That should be fine. So let's go ahead and do that. Got the end. There we go. So we've got it up and over. I basically want to make my connection right there. So in order to loosen up the ground connection right there, you're going to need a 10mm socket to loosen that up. I'm also planning on taking the bracket out and cleaning that up, because that is actually also connected there. That would be this bracket right here. This bracket is connected to the radiator. So that's connected about right there. So loosen that. And I've already disconnected it over here because I was cleaning the terminals and I wanted to get a good connection here. But I'm planning on, once I get this thing complete, I'm going to go ahead and return that back to its original position. You could also do this from the brake master cylinder access panel through the trunk, but since I have the car elevated, I'm just going to go underneath it like this. Now you have a couple washers. You don't want to lose those. Okay, so I was able to get the radiator bracket off, and I'm going to clean the heck out of that. It looks pretty rusty and dirty. What I'll probably do is connect this down here and then reconnect it at the radiator. I may have to bend this thing a little bit because I'm going to be installing the other terminal connector for the ground wire. Hopefully underneath it. I want to get underneath it so I'm in direct contact with the frame and not over this, which there could be some resistance there. So you're going to want to do some test fitting. So what I've done here is I've got my new connector for the ground wire extension, and then I've got the two ground wire terminals. I've got one underneath the main harness terminal. I've got this ground on top. So, and then I've got the washers on top of that. So what I plan on doing, and hopefully it works, is I want to have the bracket connector on top of the grounds and in between the grounds and the washers. So hopefully that works out. So I just kind of cleaned up that radiator bracket a little bit. So I just kind of removed some of the rust, and then I plasti dipped the whole thing, and I left this end, the bottom end of it, bare, and sanded all of the rust off, or at least most of the rust that I could get off of it. And hopefully that'll provide a better connection point. So as far as the test fitting goes, I think we're going to be okay. I thought about getting a longer bolt, but I don't think it's going to be necessary, although you can. But basically what I've got here is the bolt, the washers, the radiator bracket, and then under that I've got the smaller ground wire, then I've got the larger new extended ground wire, and then under that I have the ground wire for the front harness. Okay, so we have to crimp the cable lugs onto the new ground cable. So first thing we got to do is strip the wiring away, but you need to kind of eyeball and figure out about where you need to start your strip from. So right there is good. I couldn't find my larger wire strippers, but if you don't have them, you could do this. This really isn't the way to do it, but I couldn't find my other ones. So you gotta be careful not to cut away too much of the wiring on the inside. Let's go ahead and fit that. You can turn that, twist it a little bit so that it doesn't flare out. There we go. That's good right there. And now it's ready for crimping. Actually, one thing I do want to mention is that you could apply a little bit of dielectric grease on the inside. Just a little bit. There you go. So I got my dielectric grease in there. And we're ready to crimp. Okay, so for crimping, you're going to want to use a crimping tool. I've got this one here. This one handles all the way up to 0 gauge. So these ones, how this works is you've got the ability to select which gauge you want to crimp. So these little buttons you can press in, there's springs, and you just select which gauge that you want to crimp by spinning these two. They almost look like gears. So what you do, just fit the, there we go. Sometimes you can use some electrical tape to kind of hold the lug so it doesn't actually move. I'd probably go about like right there. You don't want this to slip out. You want to hold it down. So one way I found that is to use electrical tape like right about here. And you want to crimp it right in the middle here. You don't want to crimp too far to the end or too far back. So you open up a crimping tool and go ahead and close it. And you want to crimp it on its side. So you want to crimp it from the bottom and from the top. So we are in position. Just make sure that those are connected together there and that this is flat. Okay, so then you just, so it's got these handles here, and you just push down on them. And now you've got your crimp. So it's crimped. Gotta make sure it's not gonna pull off. Yeah, that's not going anywhere. And then what I usually like to do is follow up with a little bit of electrical tape and just kind of wrap it up around here, and that's it. So that's how you crimp. So here we are at the trailing arm location. So you're going to want to loosen up these bracket bolts that are right here. So as you can see, I've already got a wrench on the nut behind it. You want to loosen that nut right there and back that off as much as you can, and eventually free it, and then keep working this off. I don't recommend having the car hanging while doing this. It should be up on ramps so that the vehicle is resting on the suspension. So my plan is to connect a ground wire here to the transmission, and on the other side connect the ground wire there and connect that to my extension, which goes to the front of the vehicle. So when you're prepping the surface for the connection here, I'll make sure this is really clean. I got some sandpaper out and I sanded it down, so I made sure it was really clean. Okay, so once you have your connection all set up, tighten it, but don't tighten it all the way, because you're going to want to reconnect this bracket to the top, which is may require a little bit of some bending. So what I want to do is reconnect it back up there. Alright, so I got the connection all made. All I had to do was bend this bracket outward a little bit, and that gave me some additional play. It's time to zip tie about like right here, and then put the wheel and tire back on, and maybe zip tie another connection over here. Okay, so here is the completed installation for the front. So I went ahead and just made a zip tie right there, and then I came over here and zip tied in a couple places just to keep everything together. And as you can see, I routed that behind the front suspension here, behind the frame. Okay, so I've got my cable stud all set up right here, and all I'm going to do is loosen that bracket bolt right there, and then just put this underneath it. And this is actually going to be connected to the transmission. So what I've done here along the channel is I've cut this, and once I'm done with that, I'm going to go ahead and connect this to the other bolt on the trailing arm bracket. Okay, so we've got the bolt loosened up. So all you need to do is just connect it, don't lose the washer. I almost forgot to mention, before you start tightening that up, you're going to want to make sure that this area right here is clean, and just to make sure you've got a good grounding point. So you could sand it down, or you could use, you could even grind it down. It doesn't look too bad. So I'm just going to apply some heavy duty cleaner to it, and maybe sand it down a little bit to get rid of some of the stuff there. Okay, so I was able to clean that area up pretty good. That's what it should look like before you connect a new ground wire to it. So I used some sandpaper, sanded it down, used some heavy duty electrical cleaner, and then dried it up. And when you're tightening this back up, a ratcheting combination wrench works really well. You kind of almost need to have one, because it's very tight in here. You get a socket, and if you don't use a ratcheting wrench, it's going to take a lot longer. And I've got this double ratcheting combination wrench in order to tighten up the nut on the back as well. Okay, so after you finish this connection right here, the next step is you're going to want to remove that bolt. You just have to make sure that this is all nice and secure. So there's a nut on the back that has to be tightened up as well there. This one here, in order to access the nut, will probably have to go from behind, but we should be able to get a ratchet on here, or a socket on there rather. Unlike here, where a socket just wasn't really a whole lot of room to work with here. So I'm going after the nut from behind, as opposed to trying to figure out another way to do it, because this is really the only option that you have. So you're going to have to access this little hole right here where the trailing arm bolt is, and then just start loosening the nut with a combination wrench. A shorter combination wrench should do the trick. So if you can get like a little socket in here, right here, and then you could take a wrench on the other side and just hold that nut in place so you can loosen this. But I would back off the nut first and then start loosening the bolt, because you don't want to snap the bolt. Okay, so once you get the bolt here loose, you're going to want to do the exact same thing you did over here. You clean that surface up really well. Make sure there's no deposits or anything on it. Yeah, so just take the bolt off and we'll go ahead and get that cleaned up. One thing you can do with these bolts, besides just sanding them a little bit here, but you want to clean the threads. So I would recommend soaking them in some CLR and then cleaning them after that. So what I like to do is, so I don't use too much, is I just put it in a little bag here, and I'll just pour a little bit of the CLR inside. And then do that. Seal the bag, you let it sit for a while while I'm doing some other work, and that's that. Okay, so I got my cable lug installed on here, and basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring it up here, and then put the bolt through there and then tighten it up. I went ahead and cleaned off this whole area right here, sanded it down, so we've got a good bare metal contact right there. And then we'll follow up with some dielectric grease. Just some advice on the plate right here. So this is the bushing plate. This is the bushing right here. So if you take these bolts out and for whatever reason you have them out for a little bit longer just to clean them or something, what might happen is this hole right here, this plate might actually come out of alignment with the hole in the frame. If that does happen, it's pretty easy to get it back into alignment. All you got to do is use like a nail or like a short screwdriver and then just stick the nail in the hole right there, and you can just actually move the plate back up into position if that were to happen. Now, if these get out of alignment to the point where you can't put anything in it, then you might be able to hammer it back, or the idea is just to kind of move it back into position. But if you do have a little bit of some room in there to get a sharp kind of pointy instrument inside there, like a nail, and you'd be able to just move the bracket or the plate back in alignment right here. So just in case that happens. So what I recommend is, if you were going to leave this, I would recommend always keeping the bolt in place so that it does not come out of alignment for whatever reason. Just keep it in place, tighten it up, and then you can leave it that way. But if you were to take this out, leave it out for a while, what you might find out is that this plate just kind of starts to slip up a little bit, and you may not be able to get the bolt in. So again, just use a nail or something and move this down. What I recommend doing is, if you're gonna connect this, do it quickly versus waiting, because this plate might come out of alignment. Okay, so I've completed the connections here. Make sure they're nice and tight. Getting the nut behind this one right here was kind of challenging. You really have to go from behind here, hold the nut in place, and then use a socket to screw it back in. But it's doable. It's just a little challenging. Other than that, this was pretty easy. Okay, so I've run the ground wire through that hole right there in the frame, and now I'm going to want to select the location of where I want to ground it to the transmission. So I've decided to go with this bolt right here on this bracket, mainly because it's kind of a straight shot right to it. I thought about going with this one right here, this one, but I don't think that's ideal. You've got this in the way, and then this isn't completely flat right here. So this actually seemed like a better choice. So I'm gonna go ahead and go with that one. So just loosen this up. We'll also clean the area as well, just like we did with the other locations. Okay, so it's able to get that cleaned up pretty good. And then I also cut my ground lead that I'm gonna use to connect right there. And I try to get a little extra so I could, just in case. So now it's time to connect the lug and then connect that to here. So the bolt, I've got that soaking in CLR right now, so that one's being cleaned up. Okay, so I got my ground cable connected. I ran it over. There's our connection. Good to go. So the next thing you want to do is you want to pull the battery out so that you can replace the main ground from the battery. So we'll go ahead and do that. So that's what mine looks like right now. So now that we got the battery out, I'm gonna go underneath the car. There's a like a little boot right here. So we'll go underneath the car and find out where that is. Yeah, so this is just zip tied together right there. We can pull this out pretty easily. This one actually goes to this trailing arm bolt right here. You can see that. That's going to be pretty hard to get to. There's just a lot of stuff in the way right here, but we'll figure it out. Okay, so what I did just now is I cut the terminal off of the ground cable, the battery cable, and what I'm going to try to do is I'm just going to try to fish it back through to underneath the car. I'm having to move this if it's even possible. If not, we'll figure it out. Okay, so I was able to pull the ground cable through that. That was pretty easy. I just put a little bit of silicone on there and it just slipped right through. Okay, so a little change of plans. I think I'm going to keep this original ground cable here. I just really don't want to mess with removing the bolts, or at least bolt. So what I did was I actually took this and I looped it backwards so that I'm able to go connect it to the transmission here. So what I did was I just took, it's pretty stiff, but it's pliable to a certain degree. So I was actually able to reroute it inside there, and there's a little opening in the frame where the trailing arm bolt connects to. There's an opening there, and I just kind of rerouted it to behind itself right there. So you can kind of see that. It comes right through there. And yeah, so I think I'll just keep it, and I'll use that as my ground from this trailing arm bolt to the transmission about right here. So that should work. It just gives me enough. And it doesn't look like it's in the way of anything. It's not touching anything else. Looks like we're good. So now I'm going to start running the new ground wire. Get some of the welding cable and we'll run that through there instead. Get the connectors going and run that to the transmission. So it's pretty easy. You just feed right through here and just through. Probably should. Oh yeah, then you pull it back that way. Could always fish it through the other way. It might be a little easier, but whatever. I'll just do it this way. So I've got just enough ground cable fished through. I'm not going to do anything at this point right here. what I'm going to do is make all the connections underneath, and then my last step is going to be to cut and run another lug here for the battery itself. So underneath here, there's like a little strap that's kind of bolted to the body right there. So what I did was I used that and a zip tie to sort of support the power and the ground wires here and keep them from touching the trailing arm right here, so they're clearing it. There's no contact at all there. And then there's this thing here that kind of serves to protect it a little bit. But that was kind of cool. That must have been there from the beginning. Now I'm back here in the cabin. I'm gonna go ahead and measure and then cut my ground cable here at the battery, and then tuck it away, and then follow up with some dielectric grease on all the different connections, and should be good to go after that. So I took the liberty of refinishing the air deflector plates. I didn't spend a whole lot of time doing that. All I did was I just cleaned them as best as I could, and then I plasti dipped them, and then I used the satinizer on them, and then I used dip coat. So I felt like sort of mimics the look underneath, because with these late model cars, what they had done in Belfast is they sprayed this kind of this rubberized undercoating on some of the metal parts in order to protect them from corrosion while they were sitting on the dock. So I thought that kind of helps blend it in a little bit. Okay, so the last thing you're going to want to do is apply some dielectric grease on the connections that you've made here. Just, you know, a little bit, and just kind of spread it over the terminal and the bolt. Okay, I went and did a little bit of research, and what I found was the original John Hervey approach was to use this single bolt right here for both ground cables. So I moved the main ground from where I had it here to this bolt here. So I picked up some new battery terminals for the battery with something a little bit more robust. Before I had these bolts on here, and because of the thickness of the lugs on the end of the cable for the ground wire, it wouldn't screw in all the way, so I went ahead and ordered these. Okay, so I got the new battery posts installed. Gotta say, these are pretty nice. So we'll go ahead and make the final connection, and we're done. Okay, so I'm just reconnecting my ground wire right now. So this is where a ratcheting combination wrench really comes in handy. Alright, so I got our battery in, everything is working great, and that's the installation. So, you know, I think this is going to be really cool. We've got the John Hervey technique, I guess you can call it, for the grounding, and then additional, like, fortified grounding running from the driver's side trailing arm bushing plate all the way to the front of the car. I think it's going to help a lot with the performance of electrical components within the car, and hopefully when I get it started, it'll start up a little bit more instant. That's kind of what I'm hoping for. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.